All right, today we talk about the Russian Revolution, which is one of the seminal events in 20th century history. It takes place within the context of the First World War and was a product of that war. And, it's the regime that came to power in Russia in 1917 remained in power until 1991. And that, of course, was a communist regime. And so, and Russia, of course, tried to export communism. So Russia was very important throughout the 20th century and not always our friend. Our meaning American. But it's not like they didn't have a point. Let's just say this. Here are two figures from Russian history. On the left, Tsar Nicholas II. He is the absolute monarch. Tsar, of course, is the Russian equivalent of Caesar. And so that's what they would call their emperors, was the czars. And there's Nicholas II. You know, he's related to the other crowned heads of Europe. I mean, he might as well be the King of England in that picture. In fact, he was cousins with the King of England. On the right, you've got Rasputin, who was an illiterate monk from a peasant background. And as you can see, he's got kind of crazy eyes there. But he was a faith healer, highly charismatic, and in general, he had this uncanny ability to stop the bleeding of the Tsar's son, Alexis. Alexis suffered from hemophilia, okay? Hemophilia being a disease where, if you bleed, the blood doesn't clot, and you are in danger of bleeding to death. And, it's a genetic disease. People snicker about this, but, I mean, it's true. The royal gene pool wasn't very deep. They're always marrying each other. And so the chances of genetic diseases like this popping up increase. And so that's the thing. And the Tsarevich, the prince, suffered this terrible condition. But Rasputin had this uncanny ability to stop it. And so Rasputin was a very, very valued member of the court, at least for the Tsar Nicholas II and his wife. Alexandra was her name. But this is always the case with royal courts, right? The people there, I mean, you're supposed to, if you're a king and a queen and you have a court, there are people who are supposed to be at the court. Those are the dukes and the counts, the nobles, okay? They're the ones who have the right to give advice to the king. But, it's always the case that the king might choose a favorite, a favorite being from a modest background, and who doesn't have any power independent of his position at court. Kings like that because they know that favorite is going to be loyal. Okay? And Rasputin was kind of like this. He's this guy from a literate peasant background. He has this apparently magical power. And the idea is that he was sitting there whispering in the king's ear, telling him what to do. So that didn't go over very well with the other members of the court. In fact, it kind of got out in Russian society that there's this guy at court, Rasputin, who is really kind of evil, and he's got the king by the short and curlies, and he's basically telling him what to do. And so any setback in the war, and of course remember that Russia is fighting against Germany, There is an Eastern Front in this war, and it's going just as badly as the Western Front. That any setback is blamed on Rasputin, who clearly is giving the king bad advice. Okay, now we talked about in 1905. Remember this? How there was the war between Russia and Japan, and Japan basically pulled a Pearl Harbor on a Russian port in the Far East and won that war, the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. There was a brief kind of, there was a revolution in that year. A lot of pent-up frustration in Russia against the Tsar. And the Tsar agreed to form what was known as the Duma, okay, which was a parliamentary body. It didn't have, I mean, the Tsar still retained absolute power, but at least the people could elect representatives to the Duma, and they could debate policy, and the Tsar could implement it or not as he wished. Okay, and we also talked about how in March of 1917 there was another revolution in Russia, and that's one of the reasons why America joined the war. Remember this? There's this debate in America, should we join the war? A lot of people did not want America to join the war, and one of the arguments they used is, why would we be fighting to preserve absolute monarchy? Okay, if we're going to fight, we want to fight to preserve and to spread democracy. Well, that was taken away in March of 1917. That argument was undermined. What happened? Actually, I should back up a bit. In 1916, there was a plot at court to get Rasputin. And part of the Rasputin myth is that it took a long time for him to die. He was like the Energizer Bunny. He just kept on going. And so what happens? It took they poisoned him, then they shot him. Okay, but the poison, he was sort of resistant to the poison. But when they shot him, the poison reduced the amount that he bled, so he wasn't killed when they shot him. And then finally they took him and they threw him in the river. And that was what finally did him in. And Alexandra, the Tsar's wife, went into shock, and conditions worsened. And in March, women called for bread, starting to riot. The troops didn't shoot them as ordered, but joined them. The Duma declared a provisional government, and 3 days later, the Tsar abdicated. So that is the revolution of March 1917. And so what happened is that the Duma now holds power, and Alexander Kerensky was head of the Duma. So that meant that America could, in good conscience, join the war, because they are fighting to preserve a liberal government in Russia. The trouble is that the Duma faced competition from these groups called Soviets. Okay, now a Soviet is simply a council. A council of, well, workers and soldiers. And they would, basically, people would set them up. If you felt the Duma was too restrictive, you could put up a Soviet in your town to represent workers and soldiers. Okay? And so there was the Duma, but there was also the Soviet, and they're both claiming, that they represent the people. And I have there the Petrograd Soviet. We're talking about, at the time, Russia's capital was St. Petersburg, okay, which was founded by Peter the Great, and it's on the Baltic Sea. At the beginning of the war, they renamed the city Petrograd because Sankt and Burg are both German. Okay, so but Petrograd, that's a nice Russian word. Okay, and so the capital is in Petrograd. There is the Duma meeting in Petrograd, but there's also the Petrograd Soviet, also claiming power, claiming that the Duma is not quite legitimate. The Petrograd Soviet represents the workers, so that really represents the will of the people. Okay, it is in this context that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known better by his revolutionary name Lenin, returned to Russia from Switzerland with German help. Okay, the Germans are not unaware of what is happening in Petrograd, and they wanted to, help sow discord. They wanted to mess things up behind enemy lines. Okay, so in Switzerland, this man, Vladimir Lenin, was hanging out. Okay, he was a Russian communist. He was a member of the Communist Party for Russia. And we talked about Karl Marx, right, and his ideology of proletarian revolution, right? So, and there are Marxist parties all over Europe. And Russia was not immune. There are communists in Russia. The Tsar obviously has no time for this. And so if they catch communists, they might send them to Siberia, or they might send them into exile. And that's what Lenin was doing. He was hanging out in Switzerland, trying to run this party from exile. Okay. Now, how to put this? There were, Lenin, in fact, was a Bolshevik. All right? He wasn't just a communist, he was a Bolshevik. There had been a split in the Communist Party between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, all right? Remember Karl Marx's theory about how, you need an industrial revolution which will allow for the creation of a bourgeoisie. And then as time goes on, the bourgeoisie is going to get more and more powerful, more and more wealthy, and the proletariat are going to get greater and more poor. And then finally, it's going to come to a breaking point, and you're going to have a proletarian revolution. So Marx predicted that revolution would come to the most industrialized countries first. And so he felt that it would probably take place in Britain, in Germany, and America. Not in Russia. Russia, as I say, did make great strides. Russia is an industrial power in its way, but it is still largely agrarian. All right, it's just this massive country with a lot of peasants in it. So, but Lenin felt differently. He modified Marxist theory. Lenin felt he could hotwire the revolution. Okay, he felt that you could go straight from a peasant society to a communist society without bothering with the bourgeois part of it. And so this is Lenin's contribution to Marxist theory. And so that's Lenin's party, the Bolshevik Party. And so once Lenin gets back to Petrograd with German help, right? They're hoping that he'll cause problems. He gets back there, and the Bolsheviks immediately start agitating. They claim, all power to the Soviets. All right, that is, the Duma doesn't matter. The Soviets are what matters because that represents the working man. They had a slogan, which was land, peace, and bread. That was sort of their promise. Okay, land as in the peasants could own their own land, all right? They wouldn't be living on a lord's land anymore. Peace, they promised to take Russia out of the war. And bread. Remember that the March Revolution happened on account of women agitating for bread, and so the Soviets promised that there would be free a bread dole. All right. This is the problem with the liberal government under Alexander Kerensky. They continued fighting the war, which by that point was rather unpopular and was causing a great deal of hardship. But I guess they figured that, Russia would lose face and it wouldn't be taken seriously diplomatically if they just finked out of the war. So on and on the war goes. Okay, the liberal government is trying to fight it. Meanwhile, Lenin and the Bolsheviks are trying to foment a coup. They tried it in July, which failed, but I guess the liberal government under Kerensky didn't take them seriously, and so in October there was another revolution where they did come to power. All right, so this is the October Revolution in Russia. This is the Bolshevik Revolution. It was orchestrated by Lenin and a guy named Trotsky. And they delivered on their promises. Okay, they allowed the peasants to seize their own land. They did start distributing bread, and immediately they signed a deal with the Germans. Okay, it was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and basically the Russians ceded vast amounts of territory to Germany in return for declaring peace on the Eastern Front. I suppose that the Bolsheviks may have lost face as a result of this. Okay, I bet there were some people in Russia who were deeply disappointed with this loss of territory, but I think a lot of people were relieved that Russia was out of the war. Okay. The Bolsheviks, for their part, wanted to concentrate on building their revolution. And they certainly did that. Okay? Because if there's one thing that communists are known for, it is, they don't have scruples. They don't believe in the golden rule. Okay? Anything that advances the revolution is acceptable. It's good. Anything that opposes it is bad. There's no fair play. There's no do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So they have absolutely no problem at all with killing people who they think might oppose them. Okay? And so there you go, murder. The Cheka, there was an attempt on Lenin's life, and so immediately Lenin authorized the creation of the Cheka, that is the secret police, with full power to commit preemptive murder. There's also the Gulag, all right, and these are essentially prison camps, largely located in Siberia, where you would, if you were a threat to the revolution, you might be arrested and sent to one of those, and you would never return. So yeah, people talk about how bad Tsar Nicholas was. And, his regime, he was an absolute monarch, and he killed a bunch of people too. But nowhere near as many as the Bolsheviks did. All right? So what you have in the wake of the end of the First World War is the Civil War in Russia, where you have the Bolsheviks and their supporters, known as the Reds, fighting against the other team, which were collectively known as the Whites. Okay, so the Whites included anyone who opposed the revolution, so any liberal opponents of the Bolsheviks. A lot of Russian minorities joined the Whites, all those, Georgians and Kazakhs and Ukrainians were on the White team. And we tend to forget that, actually Americans fought for the whites. I mean, Woodrow Wilson sent a brigade or two to fight on the side of the whites, and the British sent some as well. And this is partly why the Reds won. Okay, the Reds could say, look, the whites are traitors. The whites are allied with enemies of Russia. And in general, the whites were simply too divided. I mean, the only thing they had in common was a distrust of the Bolsheviks. But they weren't organized around a central compelling idea the way the Reds were. And of course, be careful what you wish for, right? More Russians died in the Civil War than died in the First World War. Okay, so as bad as the First World War was, it wasn't nearly as bad as the Civil War. So there you go. There is Trotsky. Okay, he was the architect of the October Revolution and the founder of the Red Army. All right, that was what the Bolshevik army was called. And here is a propaganda poster featuring Trotsky as St. George. St. George is one of the patrons of Russia. Obviously, the Bolsheviks are atheists. They have no time for religion. Religion is old school. Religion is they're like French revolutionaries, right? They're like Jacobins. They don't believe in that. Religion is part of the Tsar's regime. But this is early in the revolution when you could still have some religious imagery. So here is Trotsky as St. George killing the counter-revolutionary dragon. And of course, the dragon is wearing a top hat. The top hat is a sort of a symbol of bourgeoisie. Right? You definitely did not want to wear a top hat under the Bolsheviks. It's kind of like, remember in the French Revolution, the sans-culotte, were people who wore pants because the bourgeoisie wore breeches. Okay, so this is a sartorial thing. You don't want to wear clothing associated with the old regime. And yes, this is what I mean. I don't know if you've in the old Soviet Union, there were lots of references to October. There's a movie, The Hunt for Red October. October was a sacred month to the communists. And there's Trotsky again. People, because Trotsky lost an internal battle to Stalin, people kind of look up at that as a lost opportunity. They felt, oh, if only Trotsky had won, then the Soviet Union wouldn't nearly have been as bad. But no, Trotsky was as ideological as Stalin and as Lenin. He had no problem killing anyone who opposed the revolution. Okay, so with the conclusion of the Civil War, the Reds have victory over the Whites, and they transformed the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. Okay, people, it's like calling Great Britain England. England is obviously the largest and most popular country of the United Kingdom, but it's only one of 4 countries, the others being Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Okay, so to be technically correct, we don't talk about Russia, we talk about the Soviet Union. Russia is the largest and most important country in the Soviet Union. But other parts of the old Russian Empire are simply retained by the Soviet Union. So, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Belarus, and then all the stands in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, they're all part of the Soviet Union. And the Bolshevik party is in power. Actually, they stopped calling themselves Bolsheviks after a while and just started calling themselves communists. All right. They didn't want you to believe that there are other forms of communism. So they're victorious. They are communists, but I guess they think that they have to wait a bit to implement their ideology. Okay. Now, of course, what is their ideology? Well, remember Marxism. The whole notion is that private property is theft. Okay, they really do not like people owning stuff and profiting off stuff. They believe in from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Okay, and the government is going to ensure that this happens. Um, and it's a very compelling idea, really. There's not going to be rich people or poor people. It's just that everything is going to be owned in common, which in practice means that it's owned by the government. Unfortunately, well, if you're a communist, you can't do this all right away, or at least that's what Lenin believed after the Civil War. The place was a mess. So they did nationalize the banks and the railway and, heavy industry and other aspect. The commanding heights of the economy is what he called it. But the new economic policy did allow for informal capitalism to take place at the local level. Okay, so peasants were allowed to own the land that they'd seized, and they were allowed to profit off their crops. They could grow their crops and they could sell it at a profit. And if you owned a shop in a town, you could keep your shop and you could buy low and sell high as a shopkeeper does. So that's good if you're a peasant or a shopkeeper. If you're a genuine communist, this is horrifying. But it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, if communism is so great, why do you need to take a step back from it in order to recover from the war, right? Why not just go full bore ahead? So that's what happens in the economy. Politically, the Soviet Union had this very elaborate constitution, and it was all very democratic, and they would take everyone's opinion before making a careful consideration. And there were all these different bodies, provincial level, Soviet level, and whatnot. But really, it was all a sham because real power was held by the political bureau, the Politburo. Okay, this is sort of inner party in Moscow. Of course, they've moved the capital to Moscow, right? And Lenin dominated the Politburo, so really he is an absolute monarch, So whatever people wanted was, that doesn't matter really because it's the Politburo that made the decisions. Now, the reason why this whole thing is interesting is because of the Comintern, that is the Communist International. Communism was not, they were very expansionist, right? They believed that, they're like missionaries, all right? So they've been successful in the Soviet Union. And now this is a base from which to try to spread communism elsewhere. Okay? So they won't stop until the entire world is communist. All right? That's why there was, a Cold War, is because the Soviets were trying to expand and we were trying to resist them and, to do a little expansion of our own. So that's the thing. Communist parties everywhere in the world had to make a choice, and most of them chose to take orders from Moscow, okay, to join the Communist International. The idea being that Moscow, they have political power and they have resources on their side, and the Moscow can support communist parties in the world, the price of which is that you have to toe the party line if you are, say, a communist in England or France or Spain or whatnot. That didn't do much for PR, actually. I mean, if you're a Spaniard and you're inclined towards communism, you might be put off that your political party has to take orders from a foreign power. But as I say, most communists took the deal. And they became, parrots. They parroted the party line as formulated by the Politburo in Moscow. Now, communism gave sort of an appearance of unity, Okay, everyone in society is marching forward to a particular goal. Okay, but in reality, of course, there were power struggles. And I've already alluded to this, that there is a sort of a conflict between Trotsky on the one hand and Stalin on the other. Okay, and there is Joseph Stalin on the right with his crow's feet and his mustache. He really gave a sort of avuncular image, you know. But he was, well, he was truly evil. Okay. Um, Lenin died of a stroke in 1924. And they held a big sort of Princess Diana style funeral for him. And they put his body on display in Red Square in Moscow, and I believe it's still there. You can go visit Lenin's tomb and you can see the embalmed body of Lenin. Joseph Stalin he was from Georgia, actually, in the Soviet Union. He was Georgian. His full name was Yosef Vissarionovich Jugashvili. ILI is usually, whenever you see someone with the ILI on the end of his name, it usually is a signal that he's from Georgia. Okay. Um, he was a Bolshevik from before. Okay, he wasn't just an opportunist, but he didn't play much of a role in the October Revolution. That was more the work of Trotsky. And they gave him this title, General Secretary of the party, which really didn't amount to much. But he used it to, he was a master of office politics. He had apparently sort of infinite capacity for work and attention to detail. And he just worked all the time building up his own power base within the party. These people, if you supported Stalin within the party, you were one of his apparatchiks. That was the name given to them. And so Stalin, he was very ruthless and he wanted power, and Trotsky was the sort of main, after Lenin's death, Trotsky was the heir apparent, and so that was Stalin's job, as he felt it, was to get rid of Trotsky. And so whatever Trotsky proposed, Stalin would propose something different within the party. Okay, Trotsky was very keen on exporting the revolution. Okay, and so, yeah, his slogan was permanent revolution. Stalin was a little bit more cautious at first. He was in favor of socialism in one country. So let's build socialism in the Soviet Union first before we decide to export it. This played, Stalin was Georgian, but he wasn't, if he was going to be heading the Soviet Union, he wasn't going to be doing it on behalf of Georgia. He was sort of Russian for the time being. So it played on Russian pride that that we should focus on ourselves before we focus on the rest of the world. And people perhaps were suspicious of the military. And Trotsky, of course, had founded the Red Army, so people might have been suspicious of Trotsky for that reason. At the Party Congress in 1927, it was clear that Stalin was now the undisputed leader. He had more support in the party than Trotsky did, and by 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the USSR. And he took up residence in Mexico City, where, he lived in exile, kind of like Lenin lived in Switzerland. So Trotsky is in Mexico. And he had a claque of people, and he published newspapers and magazines, and he was criticizing Stalin. Okay, and again, if you were a communist in the 30s in America, you might have been a Trotskyite. So there were these vicious disputes between those who took Stalin's party line and those who believed that Trotsky was hard done by, and you believed more in what Trotsky wanted. In any event, Stalin managed to insert a spy into Trotsky's claque in Mexico City, And eventually this spy managed to murder Trotsky with an ice axe in the head in 1940. So that was the end of Trotsky. And of course, the guy who murdered him was made a hero of the Soviet Union. So once Stalin is in power, he does focus on socialism in one country. In fact, his ideology could be called Stalinism. It was a repudiation of Lenin's new economic policy. Stalin, it's important to remember, was very paranoid. And he felt that enemies of the Soviet Union and enemies of communism were everywhere. And he felt it was a race against time. Okay, that if the Soviet Union did not industrialize and industrialize quickly, that it would be taken over by the West. And so Stalin immediately launched a series of so-called 5-year plans. These are like the strategic plan at Reinhardt. Simply, what do we want this place to look like in 5 years? Okay, and so Stalin and his apparatchiks would draw up these elaborate 5-year plans of what they wanted the Soviet Union to look like, and it was all very much focused on heavy industry. Okay, how many more tractors are we going to produce? How many more miles of railway are we going to lay down? Locomotives are we going to make? How many hydroelectric dams are we going to produce? This sort of thing. Okay, heavy industry, consumer goods, stuff that makes life more comfortable on a daily basis, nylons, washing machines, foodstuffs, none of that. That doesn't matter. None of that matters. Okay, really, your job is to support the Soviet Union and to build communism. It's not about you. It's not about your comfort. It's all about it's this race against time to strengthen the Soviet Union. So that's the deal with the 5-year plans, and of course it also represents a repudiation of the new economic policy in terms of agriculture. Okay, remember that the peasants were allowed to seize their own land and sell their crops. Well, no more. Part of Stalinism is that agriculture would be collectivized. So basically there's no more private property. All the land is to be owned by the state. The individual holdings were going to be amalgamated into massive plantations, and the peasants who formerly owned it are reduced to the status of state employees. Okay, they might live in a dorm, and go out every morning and work in the fields and then come back, and they'd be, paid for their work. But the profits from the agricultural production would belong to the state, or at least just the surplus would be expropriated by the state and would be used to feed industrial workers. So that kind of stinks if you're a peasant. And what's even worse is that if you offered any kind of resistance to this, you would be shot. Okay? Stalin was not prepared to tolerate any dissent, any alternate sources of power. And they just, ideologically, communists don't like people who make a profit. And if you're a kulak, if you're a well-off peasant who's made a profit from his goods, you are immediately suspect. And chances are you will not survive this. And needless to say, the communist ideology says, well, once we collectivize agriculture, then we're going to free it from profit, and we're going to have a great bounty will be produced. Well, of course, that didn't happen. These collective farms were not nearly as efficient as private enterprise. Not only that, but Stalin oftentimes simply expropriated all the food, didn't leave any to feed the workers. Okay, and so there was in the 30s in the Ukraine a massive famine, which killed millions of people. The Ukrainians call that the Holodomor. Okay, Stalin doesn't care. Okay, keep in mind that building socialism in one country requires sacrifice, and if you're the one who's going to be sacrificed, so be it. All right, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So it's not about you. Too bad. Then, and this is more to the point of sort of Stalin's personal paranoia. There's lots of people in the Communist Party who knew a time before Stalin. They had joined the party in the early days before the revolution. They'd participated in the revolution. They knew that Stalin was never as important as he now said he was. And so Stalin felt that it was a good idea to get rid of them. Because they knew a time before Stalin. They weren't as impressed with Stalin as he was hoping. And so, again, in the 30s, people would be arrested. They'd be put on trial, these massive show trials. They would have these ludicrous charges given against them that they were working with Trotsky or they were working with Western powers to undermine the revolution. Usually, some of them voluntarily admitted that they were doing this because they too believed that their job was to sacrifice themselves for the greater revolution. Others were simply tortured into confessing, and then you were usually shot. And so about 700,000 people were executed or sent to gulags as the result of the Great Purges. So Stalin was the indisputed master of the Soviet Union, and everyone else, everyone in any kind of position of power, was his lackey. Okay, that's not the image that that projected. If you weren't, how to put this? I mean, it's the Soviet Union is a totalitarian society. All right. There are no alternate sources of information except for the party. Propaganda is blaring everywhere. And there are posters up everywhere, glorifying Stalin. Okay, and a lot of people, I mean, it's like if you were to go to North Korea today, you'd see posters of the leader up everywhere. All right. And no alternate sources of information. And so that was something that was pioneered in the Soviet Union. All right. So this is the Soviet personality. Stalin's face was absolutely everywhere. Here is an example of socialist realism. Okay, that was the official style of the Soviet Union. It was representational and very heroic. So here we have sort of this communist genealogy. You've got Marx and Engels, authors of the Communist Manifesto on the right. Then next you've got Lenin, who modified their theory, and now you've got Stalin on the left. The great Stalin, the genius, the lodestar of the 20th century, and so on. All right. Here's another thing. Stalin looking great, larger than life, and everyone is gathered around him. And communist propaganda always shows people looking resolutely forward into the great future. Okay? So there you go. That's your typical. And of course, the red flag, the banner of the revolution, is in the back there with the communist insignia. Here's another piece of Soviet propaganda. Stalin as captain of the ship. Okay, again with the red flag of the Soviet Union behind him. It looks like CCCP, but of course remember that they're using the Cyrillic language, so that actually says SSSR, which is Russian for USSR. Okay, Union in Russian is Soyuz. So Soyuz, Sowjetische Sozialistische Republika. All right. Here's another one. Stalin. Oh, how can you not like him? Look at that. He's got that avuncular look. He's got that cute mustache. He's got those crow's feet. He's got that little smile. But of course, he was a tyrant underneath it all. In the front, you've got sort of the Soviet youth group, the Young Pioneers. Okay. If you were a good student and ideologically pure, you were allowed to join the Young Pioneers, where you would be propagandized in the glories of communism, and oftentimes encouraged to rat on your parents if you heard you were supposed to listen in on them and make sure that they weren't thinking counter-revolutionary thoughts. You see there in the background the army also marching forward with smiles on their faces, and airplanes in the top. Of course, the Soviet Union was very keen on military equipment as well, so they're spitting out lots of that. Um, and here's a young pioneer with his dad, kind of looking like Lenin, okay? But look at this. Oh man, look at this glorious future that awaits us. Not like the picture there, right? This is the old ways where people were starving and marching, with in the wake of Napoleon's invasion. Look at that. Look what awaits you, my young son. And on the table there, you've got Pravda. That's the Soviet daily newspaper. Pravda means truth. Very little of what was published in Pravda was true, but it was certainly the party line. So if you were living in the Soviet Union, it really behooved you to read Pravda because you didn't want to say anything that was against the party line. So yeah, people would read it on a daily basis to find out what they were supposed to believe. Socialist realism also included sort of artistic production like novels and plays, and oftentimes you'd have, young men and women would fall in love with each other, and their love would help increase their tractor production quota or something like this. All right. The insignia of communism, of course, is a sickle and a hammer. The hammer for industrial workers, the sickle for agricultural workers. And so here you got the hammer and sickle, and then on either side you've got a male industrial worker, a female agricultural worker. So in this case, there's a romantic element to that as well. This is quite typical here. People happy or resolute, but certainly gazing into the future, into the bright future that communism promises for them. Okay. And this is the thing, all right? I mean, they promised that communism would give them sort of all sorts of good things. Well, those good things didn't necessarily appear off the bat. Well, they were always promising it's right around the corner. Okay, don't worry about it now. Soon it's going to work out for us. So let's look to the future. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow, right? Okay, so why? Why is this appealing? Why would anyone go in for this? Right? Well, certainly the idea is appealing on some level. Okay. Everyone gets morally outraged over, some CEO who drives a company into the ground and still gets bought out for millions of dollars. People don't like it when workers are exploited. Can you imagine if we didn't have those massive profits? Everyone could have that. Okay, it would be much more fair. All right, and even the totalitarian aspect is appealing to people. Wouldn't it be great if we were all on the same page? If all of society were united around a single goal and marching towards a single goal? Okay, you wouldn't have people trying to exploit others. All right, we're all in this together. And this is especially appealing in the Depression, right? Keep in mind the stock market has crashed in 1929, and the things they tried to do launched a massive worldwide depression. So the 1930s, of course, was a shambles. The economy contracted, and lots of people were out of work with no possible hope of finding it. And so a lot of people were saying that capitalism was finished. Communism, well, maybe we should try communism then. All right. And, communism, they tried to They said that religion was bunk. Marx described religion as the opiate of the masses, that it's all an illusion, it's all a fairy tale that they tell you to make their exploitation seem acceptable. All right. But of course, you can drive religion out with a pitchfork, but it always finds a way back. And there are people who have noticed the similarity between communism and religion. All right. It has a body of high priests. It has a dogma. It has sacred texts. It has people who are only entitled to interpret that. It demands complete obedience, even unto death, as Christianity does. And of course, in the Catholic Church, the saints' relics are very powerful. Well, look at this. They've put Lenin's body on display. And that was a major tourist attraction, and people can go and see Lenin's body as though they're lining up to see the body of a saint. Okay? Well, and so it's like, well, okay then. Okay, so communism is kind of a religion. Well, then, is it any worse than Christianity? Right? Is it any worse than Christianity? I would say no. Or I would say that it is worse than Christianity. Okay? That is, Christianity, for all its faults, for all its excesses, at least endorses the golden rule. At least it says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that is always sort of in the back of a Christian's mind. And whenever he pulls something like the Crusades or the Inquisition or any kind of other self-righteousness, you can always criticize him by saying, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be doing that. That violates Jesus' command. And eventually, sometimes Christians say, hey, you're right. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. I'm very sorry. Okay? So there are scruples in Christianity. That is simply not the case with communism. They did not recognize any check on their power. Okay, and famously, Tsar Nicholas II, an absolute monarch, a relic of the old ways. How could you possibly support him? Well, as it pointed out, within a few weeks of coming to power, the Bolsheviks killed more people than the Tsars did throughout the 19th century. Okay, so the notion is that those who believed they had God on their side were nowhere near as deadly as those who believed they had history on their side. And so, yeah, I would say that communism is worse than Christianity because it does not recognize any check on its power. It's not like if you oppose communism, it's not that you're wrong, you're illegitimate, you're not, you're an enemy of the people, and you do not deserve to live. And now, the Soviet Union did mellow after a while, especially after Stalin's death in 1953. But it was still a place where you didn't have freedom of speech or freedom of thought. And, they continued to run these gulags. And it wasn't a fun place to live. And not only that, they tried to export their ideology as well. Okay, so with that, I'll end. And we will talk more about this some other time.